something that is known for advancing and retaining women. So without further ado, Monica, I'm going to send it back to you.
Thank you, Joan. And I'm just so thrilled to have this conversation. As you know, ChIPs' mission is to advance women to the highest levels of leadership in tech law and policy. And we've got incredible examples with ChIPsters, including USPTO Director Kathy Vidal, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, GC of the Year Karna Swanner, and so many more. We are really grateful for our partnership with Diversity Lab and Caren for leading that relationship to really leverage data-proven measures to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in law firms and legal departments. We can't be bothered by those who don't want us to have equity. I'm tired of asking for permission. And in the great words of Kamala Harris and now Michelle Obama, we've got to do something. And so to lead this conversation, to allow us, to inspire us to take action and to really do something, I'm thrilled to have with us today Caren Ulrich Stacy, the founder and CEO of Diversity Lab, Lois Durant, the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Sheppard Mullin, and Miko Ando Brown, a ChIPs GC Bootcamp member. And if you'd like to learn more about that, ask me. And founder of Project Ganesha, one of the winners of the recent Diversity Lab hackathon. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Caren. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, Joan. Thanks, Olivia. We're super glad to be here today. So I love the title of this because not only are we going to answer the question today, every single one of you that's on the call has been working towards moving the needle for a long time. And so the good news is that the answer is yes. So I don't want to bury the headline, I'm just going to start with it right away. And I've been lucky enough to be joined by Lois and Miko, who are going to talk a little bit about that answer yes from their perspectives. Miko has a long history in-house at legal departments. She also has been in the law firm side of the world too, but today I'm going to ask her to address a little bit about what she's seen from her history in legal departments, including Airbnb. And then we're lucky enough to also have Lois join us today from Sheppard Mullin. And I want to give a quick shout out because this hasn't been publicly announced yet. But as Joan mentioned, every year we work with ChIPs to look at the inclusion blueprint, which, as Joan said, are policies and practices and actions that law firms take in order to create a more inclusive environment. And we look at it at both the firm-wide level and the practice group level, and in particular in IP. And some of the things we look at, for instance, on the firm-wide level are, do firms do pay equity analyses? Do firms think about, is there equal access to who's getting credit for when new work is brought in or expanded? At the practice group level, which I think is incredibly important, because this is where the rubber meets the road. For those of you in law firms or those of you who had been in law firms, work is doled out at the practice group level. Sponsorship is mostly done at the practice group level. So the things that make or break careers of lawyers typically happen at the practice group level. So Inclusion Blueprint also measures those things. What can we be doing at the practice group level to ensure that everything that we're thinking about and everything we're doing is inclusive and equitable in terms of our talent practices? Every year through the Inclusion Blueprint, we have 250 some odd firms complete it. Diversity Lab's PhD data scientists run the data, and we look at who's taking the most action and are those actions resulting in more inclusivity and greater diversity. And when we run those numbers, we typically find two things. There are firms that are really doubling down and looking at their inclusive practices from a gender perspective and making sure that that's resulting in a more balanced profession. And then there are also firms who are looking at it more broadly as well and thinking about our LGBTQ population, our lawyers with disabilities and others, which, as Joan mentioned, we call inclusion for all. And although this hasn't been announced yet, I just want to highlight Lois' work and the work of her firm at Sheppard Mullin, because they are one of this year's recipients of the Inclusion Blueprint Honor Roll that is awarded by ChIPs. And that won't be announced until September, and then at the ChIPs Summit in October. But Lois, 2 thumbs up, 5 stars, all of the things.
We are delighted. Thank you for the honor. It always is nice when you win these awards, not just to win awards, but because I think it serves as like third-party confirmation that you are doing the right things and hopefully helping to move the needle. So
Agreed. Well, and social science tells us that progress begets progress. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The bright spots. Where have we made progress? And then obviously, what can we do and continue to do to make progress? So I'm going to share some slides because I think it's important to see where the progress lies. And give me just a sec, because me and technology sometimes don't get along. All right. Did this work? Can you all see my screen? Perfect. Thank you. All right, so are we moving the needle? So as I mentioned earlier, I didn't want to bury the headline, and I just told you all right away what's happening. The answer is yes, but the answer is not yes when we look at and when we consider all of the areas in which we could make progress. And so I want to take you through some of those things today, and 3 things in particular we're going to talk about. One is, are we making progress on achieving a demographically balanced profession? And I'll explain what I mean by demographically balanced, because I think that's really important from a data analyst standpoint for us to know what is our North Star? What are we headed to? When we look at data, it's just interesting. But when we look at data and we ask the question, have we made progress? Towards what end? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The second thing we're going to cover are law firms and corporations staying committed to this important work, and what are they doing? And that's definitely where I'm going to ask Miko and Lois to chime in. And then, are there current headwinds that we should focus on and guard against? And I think the obvious answer is yes, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that law firms and legal departments are using in order to defend and fortify DEI in our current climate. I do want to offer and suggest that you ask questions throughout, because I don't want this to be us talking at you. I really want this to be a conversation. All right, so are we making progress? As I said, the answer is yes, but with a couple of caveats. So in a few moments, I'll show you some slides that take you through each of these. But essentially, I think it's important to know some of the bright spots right up front. So representation in 7 of the 9 historically underrepresented groups at every level in law firms has increased over the last 10 to 20 years. That includes women lawyers, LGBTQ+ lawyers, lawyers with disabilities. And then when you break down underrepresented racial and ethnic groups by Asian, Latinx, Black, and multiracial, we've made progress. Where we haven't made as much progress, and I will tell you that the numbers are small, so it's also difficult to see progress when we're talking about, unfortunately, such a small number of humans. But in terms of Native American and Hawaiian and Island Pacificer populations, we have not made a huge progress. When we look at legal departments, we don't have as much data, but what we do have data on typically are the highest echelons, the GCs and the chief legal officers. And what we've seen in that group is that they've nearly tripled in terms of women and racial and ethnic minorities over the last 15 and 5 years, respectively. And I'll show you that data. Where we've got some pretty significant gaps in law firms are associates in comparison to partners. We see the trajectory of associates going up at a pretty high rate, whereas the trajectory for partners, not as much and not as fast. Similarly, when we think about the breakdown of racial and ethnic diversity, our Latinx and Black partners, representation is increasing at a much slower rate than all other partners. And then lastly, lawyers with disabilities and LGBTQ+ data is fairly incomplete. And there's likely 2 reasons for this. One, there's been some question as to whether or not self-reporting is as voluminous as we would hope or expect. Part of this is trying to create a culture of inclusion and acceptance in our environment so that people with disabilities and our LGBTQ+ populations feel comfortable self-reporting or self-identifying. The other difficulty we're having is a number of law firms and legal departments up until recently didn't collect this data, either in their hiring talent practices or either in their census. So this has become something that's much more widespread and done more regularly in the recent past. But again, lawyers with disabilities and LGBTQ plus data are still likely somewhat incomplete. So what do I mean when I say a balanced profession? So we're going to use men lawyers as our base so that we can kind of get grounded in the data. So the black dotted line are men law graduates. This is essentially our available workforce. These are the folks that have gone into law school and have graduated. And these are the folks who populate legal organizations. And most readily, what we're talking about today are law firms and legal departments. If we have a balanced representation of people in our organizations, essentially, all the other lines on this chart would match the black dotted line. So in other words, the expectation would be if 50% of our law school graduates are men, it would make sense that in a law firm setting, 50% would be associates, 50% would be partners, and in a legal department environment, because as we know, in a lot of instances, our legal department lawyers typically flow out of law firms. It's not true always, but a large portion of the population in legal departments have spent time in law firms. And so we should see essentially a 50% population there when we're looking at legal department representation and even GC representation. When you look at this chart, I see two things, and it'd be interesting to see what you see as well. In terms of balanced representation, there's pretty much balance when you think about the available workforce of law graduates. They're coming in as summer associates in the same representation, and then as associates similarly. But where we see an overrepresentation is with partners and male GCs. And so what this tells me is that we have a pretty balanced representation at the associate and at the summer associate levels in comparison to the balanced workforce, but there are more men in leadership than there are represented in our associate populations, our law school populations, and in our summer associates. Now, this won't surprise you as we move and we look at women, that dynamic flips. And you'll note the black dotted line, we see some similar representation as we did with men for women, summer associates, and women associates. So very similar to men, we're seeing a balance with law school graduates, and we're seeing a balance with summer associates. And then we're seeing close to or getting to a balance with associates. But it's completely flipped when you look at leadership. And we're seeing that women are underrepresented in the partnership and in women GCs. But here's the second thing you see in these charts is the good news is there's an upward trajectory in the last 10 years for almost every single one of these populations at every level. So that's why, when we started this with saying, are we moving the needle? The answer from a trajectory standpoint, as we look at each of these groups, is actually yes, for almost every single one of them, with the two caveats I mentioned at the beginning. But the question of balanced representation is where we're still not seeing as much progress as we'd like to. So now that you've kind of an orientation, as I take you through the next several slides, I'm not going to go through each of them, but I'm going to ask you to focus on the black dotted line and then look at where the various populations and levels are relative to that black line. So again, anything over the black line is overrepresented, anything under the black line is underrepresented, and anything that meets in the middle with the dotted black line is balanced representation. So this is people of color, and one of the reasons that this is an aggregated chart, and this is important because the data is difficult to collect on this because NALP, MCCA, and other various reports have collected data in different ways over different years. And 10 years prior, the data was only collected as people of color. It wasn't collected in a disaggregated way, thinking about Asian and Latinx and Black and our other underrepresented populations. So people of color is the most fulsome set of data that we have. So it's important to look at it this way, but you're going to see in the future or in the next couple of charts, we don't have as much data when we break down people of color because it wasn't collected by some of these organizations in that same way then. But focus on the black dotted line. You'll notice that there's overrepresentation on summer associates, which likely means that our law firms and our recruiting departments are really focused on making sure that we're creating a pipeline of diversity and of diverse summer associates as we bring folks into the law firm setting. But then some things happening between when they enter our organizations and when they advance to associate to partner and so on and so forth. This is where you're going to start to see a lag in the data. We only have the last 10 years when we're talking about law school graduates for our Asian populations. But you will notice two things. There's an overrepresentation in associates and in summer associates from a data perspective. And there's an underrepresentation when you're looking at GCs and partners. But there is an upward trajectory in almost every single one of these lines. Here's our Black lawyers. Again, our recruiting is clearly making an impact, and the focus that we've had on recruiting entry level is clearly making an impact. Something's happening once these individuals come into our organizations. Latinx lawyers, you're going to likely note that of all the charts and graphs I'm going to show you today, although this one does in fact have an upward trajectory, it has the least or lowest upward trajectory of all of the populations. And it's moving at a slower pace in terms of the upward trajectory. And you'll also notice that it's got some of the biggest gaps between our populations of law school graduates and those coming into and advancing in our organizations. Lawyers with disabilities, this is what I mentioned earlier, pay special attention to the left-hand side of the screen where it shows you the percentages. These are very low percentages. So in other words, if you look at the left-hand side, you're seeing that we are looking at anywhere from 2% to above 6% in terms of people with disabilities, law school graduates. We think that upward trajectory is likely more self-reporting and a better collection of data, but it also could be, and we won't know this for a number of years, more lawyers with disabilities entering our profession because we are trying to create a more inclusive and equitable legal environment. LGBTQ+ lawyers, the data is probably showing a very similar thing in terms of self-reporting and self-identification as well as collection of data. But what you are seeing is a pretty big increase in trajectory in that self-reporting and in the collection of data, and hopefully in the idea that we're creating a culture of inclusion for LGBTQ+ lawyers. And then lastly, like I mentioned, we don't have a ton of data on legal departments, but what the data does tell us is that we're seeing an upward trajectory as it relates to Fortune 1000 racial and ethnic minority GCs. And if you look at that blue line, it's a pretty steep upward trajectory. And then we're also seeing an upward trajectory in the Fortune 1000 women GCs. Not as much if you look at Black GCs, Latinx GCs, and which one am I? Asian GCs. All right, so I just wanted to give that grounding in the data, because I think the first part of this is, we hear so often that we're not making progress. And the answer is we actually are making progress. We may not be making it as quickly or as much as we'd like to, but that's why I think today's session is so important, because I think what Miko and Loy and I and ChIPs are trying to do is talk about where those bright spots lie so that we can double down on those. But this is a really particular and important time to be double downing on those, because you've all seen the press where a number of corporations have backtracked or even slashed their programs and their DEI departments as a result of some of the anti-DEI rhetoric. But I will tell you that even though those sensational headlines are dominating and potentially populating, the press with negativity, there is a lot that is still continuing. And in fact, Littler did a study in January of this year of 300 plus C-suite executives across a number of corporations. And that data is telling us that 57% of those companies grew their DEI efforts over the past year. 91% said that the Supreme Court opinions have not dampened that DEI is a priority, and 6% decreased. And I would venture to say those were organizations that DEI wasn't aligned with their values anyways. So the Supreme Court, the Muldrow case, all of the things happening that are creating, the polarization of this subject matter, they're backtracking and it wasn't aligned with their values. And so it's weeding the folks out who weren't already or really invested in this work from the very beginning. But I'd like to open the floor and ask Miko and Lois to chime in on this because, Lois, you've seen it not only from your firm's perspective at Sheppard Mullin, but Miko has had opportunity to see it from the legal department perspective, as well as the legal department perspective pushing on law firms in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Lois, can I kick it to you first?
Yeah, I think that data doesn't surprise me because that is, Sheppard Mullin has not wavered a single bit on our commitment and kind of our objectives. And I think it's because, and yes, Miko, we are getting pressure from clients. But I think our firm and other firms know it's aligned with our values and it's necessary for our business to be successful. And so I think, in spite of the headwinds, and certainly people did risk management analyses, and there are organizations out there telling you what to look at and ways that you can tweak or communicate things so that you are not unnecessarily provocative. But I think it is, how do we continue to do the things we need to do to move forward? And how do we do that without getting into unnecessary fights, but never are we going to stop doing this work, or are there things that we should stop doing? And I think that is important. And I think the other thing is a lot of the noise around the criticism of DEI work, it's focused on kind of like the things that are obvious, right? But not like the work that we're doing day to day around practices, policies, and initiatives of moving things forward. And so they're looking at outcomes. And so in some ways, we've continued to do that work without being bothered by it at all. And so we have a lot of work to do, and we pay attention to what's going on in the news, but we kind of keep our head down and do what we're doing.
I would say my perspective, and Airbnb is a huge legal department. So I was one of about 200 lawyers, but from my perspective, it was very consistent. What I saw was very consistent, Caren, with the data that you shared. After the Supreme Court decision came down, and in light of some of the recent headwinds, I did not see Airbnb slowing down its DE&I efforts or pulling back at all. If anything, it was a double down on how important this is. So it was business as usual, based on what I saw in terms of pushing our outside counsel to staff our cases with diverse lawyers. Our affinity groups were still going strong. Our DEI initiatives were still going strong. And that's pretty consistent with my friends who are in other legal departments as well. I just did not hear anybody backing down. Oops, I think you're
Sorry, I had to do the whole, you're muted, Caren thing. Somebody has to do that first.
Yeah, at least once.
Yeah, so I did it. So we're done now.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear Lois and Miko, your perspective. And I saw Jeremiah, your chat about that you're surprised with the 91% response. And it's interesting because just today, Corporate Counsel had an article, and I pasted it, Jeremiah, following your chat, that said, what's probably happening is that a lot of legal departments and corporations are staying committed, but I think, Lois, to your point, they're calling it something different, or they're being less loud and proud about it than they had been previously. And I typed in this new study as well as the sentence that I thought was kind of representative of the discussion we're having right now, which is, you know, the headline grabbing retreats are not indicative of a wider corporate disaffection with ESG and DEI efforts. All right, so
I think if I could just chime in, I think that people are calling it different things. I think that we all went and looked at our marketing materials, because that's do we have to say this in this way? This is what I mean when I say unnecessarily provocative. But I honestly don't know, and I'm part of a network of DEI professionals of any firms that thought, okay, we have to stop this. And we are doing the same number of client surveys this year. The number has not gone down, and so we haven't seen that from our clients either.
Yeah,
well, and that,
I'm
go ahead, Jeremiah.
flabbergasted, but also really encouraged to both hear from Miko and Lo. I have seen and heard the opposite from dozens of companies. I think part of it is what you said, Caren, which is they don't really want to advertise that they're stopping their programs. You know what I'm saying? So like they're kind of keeping it under the radar, but behind the scenes, budgets, programs, all being cut. It's brutal.
Interesting. Our budget wasn't cut.
I love it.
Not at all. It's gone up
I
every
love
year.
it.
Up
That's
this year.
fantastic. And
Yeah.
kudos to you and Sheppard for continuing to do it.
Jeremiah, do you think it's also focused on industries? Because it feels like, and so one of the things we're doing at Diversity Lab is we hired our first ever vice president of AI, which Jeremiah, I'm trying to follow in Meta's lead. And we created, or are in the midst of trying to create an LLM that looks at all of the DEI rhetoric, both the positive and the anti-DEI, the lawsuits, the articles, the GOP letter, all of those things. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that when we asked it, is DEI going to become a thing of the past? The answer was no. It was like looking into an 8-ball. No, if you pay attention to those organizations that are continuing to talk about it. But what we call it is changing. And so that was interesting to me to do it from a perspective of looking at it more broadly. But one of the things it did point to was tech. And it being a little bit more specific towards tech companies and the loud and proud about slashing versus the loud and proud about keeping. And I don't know if, Jeremiah, you're seeing that kind of in your side of the world.
Yeah, no, maybe that is just tech. I would say if it was just a naming thing, that would probably be less of a concern for me. But I would say some of the observations I've had have been validated by reaching out to a lot of my friends who are at like DEI educational consultancies who have like enterprise arrangements with a lot of big tech companies where they do trainings. Almost everyone I've talked to said they were fired. Like the companies just stopped, and many of them almost went out of business because they had like large engagements with some of the biggest tech firms. And then all of a sudden it was like, sorry, we don't need you anymore.
Yeah, well,
What that means is all of the great training programs, many of which I've partaken in over the course of my time at big tech companies, those are gone. I mean, some of these were like life-changing for me, these programs. And I've told you about some of them, Caren. Like,
yeah.
It's crazy that those are just gone.
Well, and I wonder if that, two things. One, you probably saw the news, I think it was yesterday, that girls in tech and girls who code, I think it was both, but I know girls in tech have shut down because they were losing funding and interest. And I wonder, Jeremiah, if that is also potentially, when you think of categories of things that we do as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I wonder if training is one of those things, because there's a lot of misconceptions around critical race theory and the trainings that people are misidentifying what training does and doesn't do, and that they're just lobbing in training in all entities with bad, not good. And so this might be some of the misrepresentation or the misconception around what we're doing and how we're doing it. All right, well, a couple of more I would say, demonstratives that are positive, Jeremiah, and others. Because I think part of what we need to look at is, for those of us in organizations like law firms and legal departments that tend to be fast followers as opposed to early adopters, right? So at least in my 33 years of experience, I see law firms and legal departments wanting to be part of something bigger than themselves. And they typically are more comfortable in larger groups. And if this law firm is doing it, it's more likely that this law firm is doing it. And I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that in a good way, in that there is a feeling of community and a feeling of camaraderie and a best practices and a learning environment that we've created when we're all working towards the same goal. It also provides cover so that when Edward Blum and others are coming after various legal departments and law firms and corporations, they feel comforted in the fact that we are a community working towards the same goal, and that what we do is legal and what we do is effective. So a couple of other demonstratives that I think will be helpful. In addition to the Littler study, there's been a question around fellowships and internships and scholarships. And, for the On-Ramp Fellowship, which was the first ever pilot that Diversity Lab ran and started 10 years ago, we haven't had a single legal organization drop out. They're still hiring women and others who are returning to the profession after extended hiatuses. So another demonstrative of a DEI effort that is working to balance representation. The Mansfield rule is another example. And again, pointing at Lois and Sheppard Mullin, who's been participating in the Mansfield rule since its inception, all 365 firms that were participating last year, almost every single one of them renewed participation in the current climate, and 19 new law firms have joined Mansfield. And participation of legal departments has tripled over the past several years. So even though, we're hearing about things being cut, we are not seeing law firms or legal departments retreat from many of the things we're working on that really are working towards balanced representation. And then the last one that and I was going to show you a graph. I don't know how easy it is to see on your screens, but this is another piece to this puzzle, is how effective are these programs? And I think that goes to something, Jeremiah, you said, which is a lot of times it's hard to quantify the effects of training. You can feel it as a human, but some of the data shows us that unconscious bias training, for instance, has been difficult to measure the effect. And sometimes when it's measured, it hasn't shown the positive effects over time that people expect it to show. So when we're looking at DEI efforts, we ask two things right up front. What is it that they're trying to do? And have they worked? And then are they lawful in taking those steps, both in how they're set up and how they're implemented? And one of the things we see about the Mansfield rule is that not only is it lawful in how it's set up, but it is actually having an impact on starting to create and working towards creating balanced representation. And then the last example that I'll use, and this would be interesting to have Miko and Lois weigh in on this, is that, and Lois, you said this, all of the legal departments that have been asking for data from their law firms, including the ones participating in the Diversity Dividends Collective, are continuing to ask their 300 plus law firms for data. And they're continuing to partner with their law firms in order to make progress on those things. And again, we have data to show that this is happening and to show that legal departments and law firms are not pulling back. And in fact, Lois, it would be interesting to get your perspective, because not only are we seeing legal departments ask about team makeup, which is kind of the baseline, like how diverse are the teams that are working on our matters, and how does that compare with the diversity of the firm? But we're seeing them ask for a lot deeper and more specific information. Who leads our team? Who gets financial credit?
Yeah.
and a number of other things. So Lloyd, please weigh in on that.
Yes, for sure. It's not just counting, heads. They want to know kind of how the hours were distributed across the team, how the substantive, skill building work, who's doing like the meaty work and how that was distributed. We have one client who has a program that reads the time entries and has categories of work, and then they will send us a report that says, your X percentage of women are doing this type of work and not and we have meetings where they're asking us about it. And so it's getting very specific and it's getting increasingly substantive, right? It's not, they've become way more sophisticated in how they're asking for data and how they're looking at the data that we send them. And so that has not changed at all, or no reduction in the amount of responses that we're sending to clients.
And Loy, although I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be sad if there was a reduction in surveys overall. But the other thing that's interesting, and it would be great to hear your perspective, and then Miko, yours, is that there's also been an increase in what the legal departments are doing with the data. So that, when I was at Arnold and Porter, what was now, I guess, 15 or 20 years ago, we were getting the surveys. We were getting 200 plus a year. And in fact, I had to actually find one entire human's job to just do the data analysis in these surveys. But one of the things we're seeing more so than we did then was the legal departments actually using the data and having conversations with their law firms about the data, and often rewarding progress. Either through, honors or awards, like, the Inclusion Blueprint ChIPs honor roll. And Jeremiah, I've even seen Meta obviously do that in other companies. We've also seen legal departments, push more work towards organizations that, from a pricing, from a value, and from a diversity perspective, are aligned with their values. But Loy and Miko, it'd be great to hear your perspective on how the legal departments are partnering with their law firms, not just shaking their fingers at them and telling them to do different and better, but truly partnering.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that from the law firm side, there's still many surveys that we do where we don't have any engagement, but more and more, I think there is, there's a carrot or a stick, right? So, we will reduce your retainer. We have a very big client that where that is possible every year if you're not kind of meeting their expectations on the DEI front. We have a client that returns some of our fees. We get money back. They give us a bonus, and we've gotten it for a few years if we're doing kind of what they expect on their matters, and so I think that the legal departments are trying to really influence law firms so that progress is made, and we have more and more requests to actually partner on initiatives and partner on trainings, or send our associates there, or send cross mentoring programs and all these things where it's really more about engaging and trying to put our heads together to figure out how we can work together to make progress.
I think I was very spoiled being at Airbnb, and it's one of the reasons why I joined the company. DE&I is just such an integral part of who the company is. That I think it made partnering with the law firms in terms of the diversity of our outside counsel a lot easier. I can't imagine any law firm would ever present to Airbnb a slate of, all white male partners or all white male associates, for instance. And one of my favorite moments when I was working with my former boss, every time I would need to hire outside counsel, his statement to me would be, Miko, I look forward to reviewing your diverse slate of outside counsel candidates. So it was just a given. But I will say, post the Supreme Court decision, at least I was a lot more intentional, and the other lawyers on my team were a lot more intentional about finding ways that we could engage our outside counsel and partner with them to make sure that our pipeline continued to be really diverse. And it might be doing things like, we'll probably get to it, Caren, my team in the Diversity Labs Hackathon did, but one of the strategies that we had was, let's partner with our outside counsel to create opportunities for their women and diverse associates to get in front of clients by doing, lunch and learn CLEs, or meet and greets, or have them come out to the San Francisco office and meet people in a way that was very low risk but high impact, both for the client and the outside counsel firm.
I'm just going to chime in really quickly here. Sorry, but we just
Yeah.
have a note in the chat. I have submitted this program for CLE. It's pending 1 hour of elimination of bias with the California Bar. There's a form in the chat that Olivia has added and a code DEIB 821. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Monica. So let's talk a little bit about what organizations are and can do lawfully and effectively, because, right, those are the two things I said that I think are most important for us to ground this work in, right? DEI is not a separate entity. It is built into our strategy in our legal organizations, or done correctly, it's built into our strategy and built into our systems. And I think there's, two at least resources that if you're not familiar with it, the New York State Bar Association did a report and recommendations, and this was immediately following the Supreme Court ruling. So this amazing group of about 50 lawyers across legal departments, law firms, academia, and government came together, and they wrote a report that essentially says what's effective and lawful, taking into consideration what we know now. So for those of you that haven't seen the New York State Bar Association report, I suggest reading it. Now, it is 91 pages long, but it's got a great table of contents, so you can go straight to the section that you're most interested in. The other resource, especially for law firms, is the Inclusion Blueprint. This is what we partner with ChIPs on, because it does lay out a strategy. What are the things you could do at the law firm level and at the practice group level to really think about having inclusive talent practices and processes so that everyone has equal access and is included in anything that's career development related. And that does bring us to the hackathon, which Miko mentioned. So a shout out, because on the screen right now, you see Miko's team, and you probably see Miko in the far right-hand side of your screen with the microphone. Diversity Lab is fairly well known for running hackathons, and we've been doing this since our inception 10 years ago. It's our 10th year anniversary, and so we ran a hackathon this year called Moments to Movements, with the idea that, when we think about the murder of George Floyd as an example, in that moment, people were very focused on what they were doing and how they were doing it. And one of the fears that I know I've had and others is that moment might end once the focus had left George Floyd and some of the other terrible things that have happened. And so our goal is to make sure that the work we're doing turns into movements, that it's not just a moment in time we're thinking about something when bad things happen, or when we know that there's been injustices or inequities, but we change those into movements. And so we asked 100 hackers to challenge themselves to come up with solutions to two different challenges. One was, how can we build DEI and inclusion and equity into our talent systems so that sponsorship and work allocation and all of those things that we do on a day-to-day basis that make or break our lawyers' careers are equal and inclusive? And then we said, and also, how can we come together as a community to defend and fortify DEI, not just in our own industry, but across industries and in the world more broadly? And so, Miko, I'd love to hear, and I'm sure everybody would love to hear, what your team tackled. And I will also say Miko's team was one of the winners. So not only was she thoughtful in her pitch, but the crowd of 200 people and the judges also thought that their idea was meaningful and would help create movements in the legal profession.
So my team was the bias busters, and the problem that we tackled was fair work allocation. So that is making sure that women and diverse associates have equal access to those really meaty, substantive, high-profile projects that are going to advance your career. and make it more likely that you will be promoted to partner. So that is the problem we tackled. Our solution was building upon an already existing app that was essentially an associate directory for law firm partners that they could filter by, seniority level, skill, experience. And the purpose of this app was to allow partners, when they had a new matter that they needed to staff, to access this directory and perhaps get outside of their comfort zone, try and really get at that proximity bias and look for new associates who they hadn't worked with to staff these matters. What we found was, unfortunately, that app wasn't being used as much as we would like. And so my team that consisted of in-house lawyers and law firm lawyers as well, we drew upon our own experiences. We did some research to find out, why aren't partners using this app as much as they could? And the primary reason was risk. Partners were very reluctant to staff an untested associate on a new client matter when they had no idea how they would perform. And clients were a little reluctant to accept a new associate on their matter who was also untested. And so our solution was to add to the app to allow partners and clients to collectively decide together what are some low risk test drive projects that these partners can use the directory for to staff these matters that will give everybody comfort that these associates are good. So it might be putting on, a lunch and learn. So for my team, I was in the trust and safety space. I wanted to know, I would love a little lunch and learn on what the new Fair Housing Act is doing in this space. Law firm, is there a woman or a diverse associate who might be able to give a primer to my team on this? And then we'd get to see that associate on their feet doing the research. And after that, I would say, yeah, I feel really good about this person being staffed on my matters. And the partner would say, I'm really comfortable with this associate being staffed on their matters because they just knocked it out of the park. So that was one of the sort of features that we added to the app that we're hoping is going to increase partner use.
Well, and interestingly, we had 10 teams, and at least 3 of the teams pitched on more fair and equitable work allocation in both law firms and legal departments, because the same thing is true of thinking about high visibility opportunities in a legal department setting. And I think, Miko, like you said, because a lot of times, just as humans, we tend to fall into our biases of birds of a feather, right? We give work to the people who we most closely have, backgrounds with, or proximity bias, who we worked with last, or who just walked by the hallway, or who we just saw on Zoom. And so part of what Miko's team and the other 2 teams that were focused on work allocation were, how do we move into slow thinking? Daniel Kahneman's behavioral science of fast thinking versus slow thinking. How do we move into slow thinking and start to create an intervention to reduce those biases? The other thing that was really interesting, again, 10 teams, 3 teams focused on work allocation, which, by the way, I think tells you how important that is in a law firm and a legal department setting. The other thing that was interesting, out of 10 teams, 3 worked on work allocation. There are 7 teams left. 3 teams of those 7 all came up with an individualized certification that individual lawyers could take action to create more inclusive and equitable work environments for their teammates, their colleagues, and their peers. And so it's so interesting to me that we're thinking about this from an organizational level, which is, Miko, your team and work allocation. Like, what at the organizational level can we do to make sure that work allocation, opportunities are fairly distributed? But the other piece of this puzzle is, what can we all individually do? What actions can we take as humans within our workplaces to ensure that we're creating, especially those that are in leadership roles, creating an inclusive and equitable work environment? And how can we get out from under our own biases? Because quite frankly, if you're a woman, you still have biases. It's not like you all of a sudden don't have biases against or for any group. It is important to think about this from an inclusivity and an allies and an advocates perspective for every single human, and what actions that you can take. So Diversity Lab is working behind the scenes right now to take Miko's idea, take Miko's team's idea, and those other winning ideas and turn them into pilots. And so I think Monica and Joan and Olivia will bring those pilots to the ChIPs community for anybody in the legal department setting or the law firm setting that wants to pilot the ideas that came out of the hackathon. Will give all of you the opportunity to do so, which I'm really excited about, because I think when the 200 people in the audience voted, it was pretty clear that these are two necessary things in the marketplace. And so we're excited to take those and make them pilots and make them experiments and then measure their success. All right, I know we have 6 minutes left. So I think it would be really great if there are questions, please pose them to Miko or me or other members of our audience, including Loy. And also, Monica, I want to make sure you get a chance to chime in, because you're seeing a lot in the marketplace and the role that you have at ChIPs.
This is always one of my favorite conversations. And I've heard a lot just in the last month from ChIPs members who tell me from the general counsel, one woman said, she's the only one who actually advocates for her law firm to get billing credit. And another law firm partner said, none of her outside counsel actually do the work to make sure that she's getting billing credit. And so I hear this a lot, and I think, Loy, it's so impactful that you're doing this, that you're helping to track it, that you're measuring it, Caren and Miko, that you're part of that solution. And so when we talk about doing something, it's really important for me to say, like, what is the action you're going to take from today? Because we can have these conversations. I mean, come on, like, I was a physics major in 1991. That means nothing, honestly, nothing. If we're not actually doing the work to continue to make sure that everyone is advancing and has those opportunities and moving the bias, because it's still there, but we can move it out of the way. We can just choose to continue to advance and elect people into those places, and we have to do the work. So I would love to know, what is one thing each of you who are on this call, all 42 of you right now, what are you going to do? And I like to call these, thanks to Carolyn Buckluse, this is my tiny mighty, right? And Caren, I know you've said this, right? Maybe you can't change the way the entire organization does its feedback performance reviews so that they're inclusive and fair, but can you change the way your team of 6 does it? Maybe you can, right? And so what is that one thing that you could actually do to make a difference today, tomorrow? Is it acknowledging someone? Is it sending a thank you letter? Is it calling your law firm partner and talking about how you can arrange for that credit, or calling your outside counsel and talking about why you need to facilitate those conversations? One thing. So that's my challenge to all of you. Are there any other questions?
There was one question by Ashley, which I would love to address, because I think this gets to the heart of everything we're doing, Ashley. So kudos to you, because it doesn't matter what we do in our law firm and our legal department setting, is as Miko said, if we can't get people, the humans, to actually buy in and take actions that were different, than they did yesterday, today. So Ashley's question is, I love the hackathon solutions, but how do we incentivize partners and other leaders to behave differently than how they've typically behaved? For example, around work allocation or idea versus impact. So I'll try to quickly put these links in the chat, but if I don't get to them, I'll make sure I embed them in the slides, because another question was from Olivia, will we supply the slides to everyone? The answer is yes. There's 2 pieces of behavioral science research. One is around nudges, and it talks about the behavioral science of getting people to do things different than they did before. And then there's also, and this is going to sound really interesting, I think, to you all, but there's also a ton of research behind habits. So what creates a habit for somebody is a lot of what motivates us behaviorally. And so sometimes it's about breaking habits. It's not that we're intentionally doing bad things. It's just sometimes we've gotten into what we did yesterday is what we're likely to do today, and what we did today is what we're likely to do tomorrow. So if we want somebody to do something different or better, the science behind nudges and the science behind habits are 2 of the things that we look to, at least Diversity Lab, when we run pilots, because like Miko said, it doesn't matter how great the app is if no one uses the doggone thing. So we embed some of that research, and Ashley, I'll share that with you because I think it is how we've motivated law firms and legal departments to work on Mansfield rule in a way that maybe they didn't seem all that bought in at the beginning, right? When we were saying to leaders, slow down and consider 30% underrepresented, some of the leaders were saying, well, you know, I already do things the way I'd like to do them. Why would I do this? And so we had to add some of that behavioral science to the mix in order to help propel interest and help propel action. But if Loy or Miko or Monica want to jump in on that, I'll put the research in.
Roy, Miko, any closing thoughts?
I just
No,
want
it does work. So I have this thing called make a list that or review a list. So every time someone says, oh, I didn't think of her or him, like make a list, right? Do not, your brain is going to fail you every time you have to make a snap decision. And so now, and I'll be on these PGL calls and they'll say that, and they will tell me, I know, make a list. And so I will send people lists. And I think you just have to remind people over and over again, even though you might feel like you're being annoying. And then eventually it becomes a habit.
And I totally agree with that. But Monica, to your tiny mighty, this came up during the last ChIPs General Counsel boot camp session. One of our speakers, Kate, I think I'm pronouncing her last name, Roan, correctly, from Bartlett Beck. To your point of what can one person do, she gave an example of how one woman can change an entire career trajectory of another woman just by giving them an opportunity. And she mentioned that there was a partner in her firm that gave her an opportunity to be the first chair trial lawyer on a case, and it completely changed her career. And it was one action by one attorney that changed this woman's life. And that's the power that each of us on this call has. And so that's what I like to keep at the forefront of my mind.
I imagine that if you're on this call, you have some form of power. And I always like to say, who's not in the room? And so when you are in the room and a decision is being made or a conversation is being held, you have that power to say, who's not here? And you can be that voice. So that's my final thought. Thank you all so much. Caren, Miko, Loy, thank you. What a tremendous honor to have the three of you join us here. This session has been recorded. It will be shared in the ChIPs community, and we will make sure that the slides and the resources that Caren has referenced will be included in a follow-up email along with the feedback form, and hopefully we'll get CLE for California approved. And great to see all of you. Hi, Cynthia.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Yeah.
Continue the hard work.